Whenever I go on the internet stumbling into any topics regarding Persona, there's always a question that gets asked quite often. Which Persona game should you play first? And honestly, it's a completely understandable sentiment. Persona games are numbered up to 5 entries. However, there are actually 6 games in the mainline JRPG series, with all of these games not being interconnected sequels despite the numbering, plus the multiple spin-offs that generate sequels of themselves. And let's not forget the confusing trend of Atlus re-releases that felt alien to the wider community. While you might have had the answer by looking into these discussions, as someone who is experienced in the Persona series, I felt like I could contribute to this discussion. So welcome everyone to today's video. Sit back and let us think about which Persona games should you play first. Quick thing that I want to exclude first, Persona 1, 2 Innocent Sin, and 2 Eternal Punishment are automatically excluded. Even though these are the first 3 games of the Persona series, these games have the huge flaw of not being available on modern platforms. Probably the most plausible way to even get these games is to either dust off your PlayStation 1 or your PSP, or get a PSP emulator off the internet and play the game through the emulator on your PC or your phone if you prefer it that way. Emulator in itself is already a lengthy process as you require the game as well. I am not going too deep into the nitty-gritty of emulation, but the point here is that Persona 1, 2 Innocent Sin, and 2 Eternal Punishment is by far the least accessible game out of the Persona series. And when you manage to play those games, I heard the game didn't age well either. I personally haven't played these games, so I don't really know, but that's basically the sentiment for these games. So yeah, these games are automatically excluded. So that leaves us to the new Persona mainline trilogy, Persona 3, Persona 4, and Persona 5. So for this video, I'm just gonna spoil it and give you the summary of what I think the ideal order of which Persona games you should play first on the screen right now. Persona 5 Royal, then Persona 3 Reload, and then either continue to Persona 4 Golden or branch out to Persona's sister series with Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance or Metaphor ReFantazio. Or, if you like Persona 3's story a lot, Persona 3 Portable might be up your alley as well. The way I'm gonna structure this video is that I'm going to explain my reasoning with this sort of ranking in sections within their own games. So let's start with the first one that you have to play the first time jumping into the Persona series, Persona 5 Royal. But before that, a word from our sponsor. This video is sponsored by First 4 Figures. If you're like me, you'd love anime and games, and as a huge anime and game connoisseur, maybe watching or playing isn't really enough. That's where hobbies like figures comes in. But have you noticed recently that the prices of figures have been skyrocketing, and when you get around to buying one of them, you realize that they are so big and you don't have the space for them. If only there is a figure adjacent hobby that requires less space with an affordable price. Introducing FiGGYZ. FiGGYZ is a new product lineup by First 4 Figures. It features a new style of collectible figures that delivers on being affordable, doesn't require much space, and is highly customizable. It has a compact body, but feels premium with a sturdy weight. It doesn't feel flimsy. One of the main things that I like about FiGGYZ is the art style that they created for these figures. It's kinda like a pixel art, but it's not as pixelated as some pixel arts out there. It kinda creates a new art style from that concept, and I like that. With the reversible metal background and the mag mount system, it gives these artful pieces a cool 3D look. With a 3M wall mount magnet included, FiGGYZ is a figure that can be placed anywhere you like. Place it on your desk, you got it. Stick it on your fridge, you got it. Stick it on your wall, you got it. FiGGYZ is also a highly modular figure, with a super rare chance of a hidden chase background included in your FiGGYZ. You'll get a chance to get either gold, silver, or bronze backgrounds for your FiGGYZ, somewhat like a prestige collection. It's a very low chance to get them, but because it is modular, you can trade for them with other FiGGYZ collectors. In fact, FiGGYZ also has a huge collector app to help you with your collections. There's a QR code in the back of each FiGGYZ that you can scan to register and track your growing collections. You can use them to see which series you have missing, see their edition, and their serial number for ease of collection. Here's a quick look at one of the figgies that I got. Here is Persona 5's protagonist, Joker. Immediately, one notable detail with this is with the dominant black outfit that Joker had, he had the contrast of bright red glows. Holding his trusty dagger in a straight pose, this figgies of Joker is a confident looking character. Accompanying the figgies is a cool background of Joker's cut-in when he lands a weakness exploit to the enemy in-game. With the zigzag line resembling the same zigzag when you achieve victory in battle, this is a cool looking figgies of a character who triumphs in his story. But if Persona 5 isn't to your liking, Figgies also made other franchise lineups as well. Lineups include character figures from Yu-Gi-Oh!, Freeran, Metal Gear Solid, Sonic, Street Fighter 2, Banjo-Kazooie, Cowboy Bebop, and a lot other notable franchises including Metaphor ReFantazio. If Figgies looks interesting to you, check them out at FiGGYZ.com and use my coupon code IZANAGI at checkout or use the link in the description down below to get a 5% discount on orders above $50. Again, use coupon code IZANAGI at FiGGYZ.com or use the link in the description below to get a 5% discount on orders above $50. Thank you again to First 4 Figures for sponsoring this video. Persona 5 Royal is the most modern Persona game up to date. I think it's needless to say the numerous things that made Persona 5 popular: the UI design, the overall style of the game, amazing soundtrack, great story and characters, you name it. Persona 5 has it all, but to be honest, you can't say this to any other Persona games. So what does Persona 5 have to make it the most beginner-friendly Persona game? Well, to put it simply, it is the easiest game both in terms of getting into due to the presentation, and it's downright the easiest game out of the Persona series. Persona 5 starts straight into a casino, and it introduces you as a phantom thief, running presumably from the security of the casino. You get to have a feel of the combat system first, coupled with the intense chase scene. It is an effective way to get people engaged into the game. It's an exciting moment through and through. And then, when you're out of the casino, police surrounds you, and you get captured. Then, you are thrown to this interrogation room, where you presumably got drugged. A prosecutor comes in, interrogating you, and this is where the Persona 5 journey officially starts, going back in time to the first time you set foot to Tokyo. This is a very effective opening for me. It's an exciting way to start off your journey with the casino escape scene, and ends the prologue with a little bit of mystery and tension, because you eventually will get caught at some point in time, but we don't really know when or what is the occasion, what you've done with the casino, and why is a high school student acting as a phantom thief. This is one of the huge reasons why Persona 5 is such a great Persona title to begin with, because it triumphs in comparison to the other Persona titles. The prologue isn't the only thing that gets a great presentation as well. One other notable thing is that when you first learn of a palace and how the palace system works, palaces are better in Persona 5 because as dungeons, these palaces are handcrafted rather than randomly procedurally generated dungeons. Randomly generated dungeons are fine. However, the downside of it is that too much of it can weigh the gameplay down as it gets repetitive after a while. So naturally, handcrafted dungeons from Persona 5 are a lot more exciting to explore, with deliberate puzzles tailored with the theme of the dungeon and mini-bosses that's appropriate to the narrative. This is not to say that handcrafted dungeons can't be bad. There's another Atlus game that did those very poorly. But the execution of Persona 5's dungeons with palaces are so well made that it feels fresh every time you encounter new things throughout the dungeon. And yes, I'm well aware that mementos do exist as the randomly generated dungeon portion of the game, but the fact that the entirety of the game doesn't revolve around that randomly generated dungeon is enough to rate it higher than other Persona games. Other than that, Persona 5 is also really easy. The difficulty of Persona 5 is notoriously a joke among the Persona community, to the point that Merciless, the quote-unquote hardest difficulty available, is actually easier than the hard difficulty. Although some scaling issues may be the cause of this stupidly easy difficulty problem, it's honestly more than that. This is because Persona 5, and to an extent Royal, introduces a lot of powerful abilities and system to you, while not really scaling the enemy to compensate how strong you are for having those abilities. So, to list those things up in no particular order, you have weakness exploit that leads to the one more system, critical strikes on physical attacks that is treated like a weakness exploit, guns for all your party members, gun abilities for Joker, technical damage on attacking enemies with status ailments with a specific attack, baton pass that greatly increases damage with every baton pass, all-out attacks, party member follow-up attacks, showtime attacks, negotiation with shadows for resources and easy win, wheel seats from palaces that gives you powerful equipments, party member confident abilities like Horizon Recovery and Protect, Ryuji's insta-kill, every accessible Velvet Room systems that allow you to make your persona super strong, persona passive traits, DLC personas, Fusion Alarm and their exploits, Third Awakening for every party members, the ability to inject stats and skills to party member through the Just Clap hangout, baton pass ranks that adds HP and SP restoration upon baton pass, technical damage ranks that makes it act like a weakness exploit, every other unlockable confident abilities, the already easier ambush techniques being easier with Kazumi's confident, workout and meditation activity that increases Joker's max HP and SP permanently, and I'm pretty sure there's a lot more to it than the points that I have mentioned, but I think you get the point by now. The problem with Persona 5's difficulty is that the enemies don't really get anything to stand up for themselves after the players gets these abilities and systems. The most significant thing that the enemies got was probably another system that I haven't mentioned previously, that enemies might spawn in this weird state dubbed Disaster Shadows, which if fought properly, they just explode, damaging every other enemies, which goes in your favor instead of against it. This is why Persona 5 gets so much of the notoriety of being the easiest Persona game ever, and personally speaking, it's perfect for a new player to jump into. Obviously, not every new player will instantly get and utilize every system and abilities that I have mentioned. Most players probably won't even interact with everything, which kinda makes the game balance it out quite a bit to create the best experience a new player can have. For example, obviously, newer players won't really delve into the persona building system to make the most broken persona ever. So their experience would be that they struggle quite a bit in the combat side of things, but is balanced out by some of the additional stuff that makes the combat easier. So all in all, the presentation, the difficulty, and the availability of the game makes Persona 5 the best game for new players of the Persona series. Oh, and before anyone asks, play Persona 5 Royal, not Persona 5 Vanilla. It is the better Persona 5 game with a lot of improvements, including quality of life. It straight up made the vanilla version obsolete. Persona 3 has the heaviest story out of all the Persona games. I obviously don't want to spoil much, but Persona 3 is the one game that you play for the story. Its overall theme of death and the acceptance of death obviously weighs heavier than what other games would ever achieve, and Persona 3's execution on the story is really well executed. I'm not really a good story person. I never really talk about stories in this channel, cause I am not really good at analyzing stories. I am good at analyzing gameplay stuffs. But that being said, I can still appreciate Persona 3's story. But before we continue to discuss Persona 3, let's address the elephant in the room. So I'm gonna rip off the band-aid here, because I think Persona 3 is the entry that people have the most nostalgia boner over. In case you don't know, for a quote-unquote definitive version of Persona 3 to play, everyone will say there are 3 contenders, for it being Persona 3 FES, Persona 3 Portable, and Persona 3 Reload. First, Persona 3 FES is the first ever re-release of Persona 3 with the Answer expansion way back in the PS2 era. It is the most faithful one to the original Persona 3 experience, with cool features like the protagonist being able to equip not just one weapon type, plus the Answer story. But because it is a really old game, it has a lot of frustrations, like party members' bad uncontrollable AI, tiredness mechanic, not being able to customize party members through the menu screen, randomized persona skill inheritance. A lot of things can be polished but aren't. It sits in the weird spot where there are cool features in them, but is brought down by it being archaic, lacking polish and quality of life. Next, Persona 3 Portable is the original PSP release that is now ported through the Persona 3, 4 and 5 remastered port around 2 years back. It is the entry that builds off Persona 3 FES with some of the positives from Persona 3 FES, improve upon its archaic design, but has a lot of negatives in it as well. The main distinction is the new female main character route being added, adding a lot more story events and social links than the original Persona 3 FES had, albeit separated to this route. A lot of polish over Persona 3 FES is present as well. Party members can now be controllable, so no struggling with the bad uncontrollable AI. However, because this is originally a PSP game, Persona 3 Portable had to dumb itself down to fit the compatibility of the PSP back in the day. So unfortunately, the presentation is a lot worse now, with light visual novel style with characters in PNGs instead of the normal Persona character models doing animations in the background. It heavily ruins the experience by quite a lot, to the point that some story moments look really weird. You sometimes don't know what's happening, or that it is just straight up being less impactful. So on the gameplay side of Persona 3 Portable, it is better than Persona 3 FES, but a lot worse in the story side of it. And then for the last one, Persona 3 Reload is the remake of the whole Persona 3 story, including the story of the original plus the answer story with the episode FiGGYZ DLC. Being a newer game, Persona 3 Reload gets a lot more polish and quality of life compared to the other games. A lot of the frustrations and confusions that can appear from either FES or Portable are almost all eliminated, making the game a much more enjoyable experience. That being said, there are some questionable changes too, in the fact that the main character is locked to one weapon type as opposed to FES, or the tiredness mechanic being removed. I mentioned the tiredness mechanic as a negative thing for being frustrating, but some people would want to have the tiredness mechanic as it amplifies the whole Persona 3's theme. Losing that would kinda tone down the stakes by some margin, and that is kinda the sentiment towards Persona 3 Reload. While being a modernized remake, it loses some of the core theme and message of Persona 3 through subcontext. So we're at an impasse here. Which Persona 3 title should you actually play? Is it the faithful Persona 3 FES that is both archaic and feel frustrating to play? Or is it Persona 3 Portable that has some improvements and new contents but have worse presentation through visual novel style? Or the new Persona 3 Reload that has a lot of improvements with better gameplay and presentation but loses some of the core theming of Persona 3 as a whole? A lot of people in the Persona fandom would say to go for Persona 3 FES. However, for me, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, just play Persona 3 Reload. Newer players won't have the same patience as older Persona fans, with the modern gaming sphere leaning towards more quality of life and polish in their games. Frustration isn't the main thing that people want to experience, and it is very understandable. People want to play games to have fun, and in line, experience new things. So the best candidate for a new player in the context of Persona 3 is definitely Persona 3 Reload. If after you've tried Persona 3 Reload, you have some sort of an attachment to the story, at that point I would say go try Persona 3 Portable for the female main character route, and to an extent Persona 3 FES as well for the faithful experience. However, for this section of this video, I will only talk about Persona 3 Reload. Now, onto the nitty-gritty of Persona 3 Reload. So the positives first. I think it's safe to say that the overall presentation of Persona 3 Reload is somewhat on par with Persona 5. They still have their UI game in and have the modernized character models following Persona 5. Being a newer game, Persona 3 Reload had quite a lot of improvements over Persona 5. One example of such improvement is voiceover on social links. This might not seem like a huge change, but the effect really stands out. Having both visual and audio aid really helps with the comprehension of the story, especially when the story of Persona 3 is a lot heavier than Persona 5. This is compounded by the amount of additional story events and hangouts that you can do in Reload. Male party members now have hangouts to compensate for the lack of social links for their story, making their story feel more complete and heartfelt. Other improvements aren't strictly improvements over Persona 5, but are also improvements over other Persona 3 titles. Like for example, gameplay-wise, Persona 3 Reload gets some new additional system that makes Persona 3 Reload plays a little bit similar to Persona 5. Baton Pass is here under the shift mechanic, but is stripped down of their bonus effects. It's just to effectively change your party member so you have a good flow of combat. Another notable point of change is that Persona 3 Reload has this new FiGGYZ system which party members can cast either to attack enemies with huge damage output or to gain a specific effect to your party. FiGGYZ is a character specific action, so each party member has different sets of FiGGYZ that heavily impacts the battlefield. It's kinda the ultimate move for each party member. Because of this, and the shift mechanic, and the numerous more systems introduced in Reload, Persona 3 Reload is significantly easier of a game than the other Persona 3 titles. However, I find Persona 3 Reload has fairly difficult moments for their gameplay, both on the overall difficulty and, back again, the actual content of the gameplay of Persona 3. Persona 3 Reload isn't as stupidly easy as Persona 5 Royal. Persona 3 Reload has moments where the game feels pretty hard, especially when the newer systems in Reload aren't introduced yet throughout the story. Persona 3 Reload is harder on the first few hours of the game, and gets easier the longer you play it. This can be very detrimental for newer players who aren't very familiar with Persona as a whole. But this is unfortunately compounded by the design of the dungeon crawling gameplay as well, because most of the gameplay is tainted by the base design of Tartarus. Tartarus is the main dungeon and mainly the focus of the gameplay. You climb this huge tower to the top. Not only that being a long dungeon instantly makes the dungeon feel repetitive, it is compounded by having its layout randomly generated, with very few things that are deliberately handcrafted, making Tartarus feel old quite easily. Honestly, Tartarus is like Mementos from Persona 5, but it's worse because, well, you can't insta-kill with Ryuji in Persona 3 Reload. I've seen a lot of the consensus here. The thing that drags down Persona 3 Reload quite a lot is the Tartarus gameplay, as it can get boring, which is very much understandable. Fast and Portable had this problem as well. It's baked into the story of Persona 3. Just to assure you, this is not a Reload thing. Furthermore, the Tartarus gameplay gets worse though, because the episode FiGGYZ DLC is also notoriously known for being the same Tartarus dungeon crawling gameplay, only sprinkled with some new story bits. So yeah, a lot of the weight of the Persona 3 Reload experience gets dragged down by the Tartarus gameplay, which ultimately makes this a worse first game for getting into Persona than Persona 5. I haven't mentioned this yet as I explained a lot about the Tartarus gameplay, but the opening of Persona 3 isn't as strong as Persona 5 as well. Instead of the high-octane chase scene in a casino, Persona 3 starts straight into the city where something do happen at first that leaves a mystery about the setting, but the story doesn't really pick up until like the main character's awakening. It happens in quite a bit of time from the opening, so it loses a point over Persona 5. I guess the only saving grace above the other games that I want to talk about next is that Persona 3 Reload is a lot more modern as a game. It is readily available in most modern platforms, a lot of polish and quality of life, some improvements above Persona 5 in some places, but to top it all off, Persona 3 has the heaviest and the most hard-hitting story of all the Persona games. So if you don't play Persona 3 the first time you play a Persona game, I heavily implore you to play Persona 3 Reload just for the story alone. From this point on, assuming you've decided already to play Persona 5 Royal and then Persona 3 Reload, this is the point where the decision branches for a lot of people. Playing two Persona games back to back is tiring, especially if you can spend around 80 hours plus for each game. If you're experiencing burnout at this point, please take a break. One thing that single-player games have as an advantage over live service multiplayer games is that you are not pressured to play at certain times. There's no fear of missing out in these games. However, if you still have it in you, here are my recommendations of what you should play next. The first one, after Persona 3 Reload, if you still want to experience the same Persona franchise, it is time to set foot in Inaba with Persona 4 Golden. Okay, I'm gonna be biased for a second here, because I think Persona 4 Golden is the best Persona game ever. I mean, I'm pretty sure you can guess that already. It has one of the most engaging story to me. A detective mystery story is automatically a great story for me. The gameplay, while lacking in the modern Persona polish, It's decent and serviceable, and to top it all off, the casts are brimming with great and likable personality that makes the moment-to-moment of Persona 4 feel so lively and enjoyable. Persona 4 Golden is the game that I fight with on a personal level. That being said though, to be objective, because this is the oldest Persona game when compared to Persona 5 Royal and Persona 3 Reload, Persona 4 Golden didn't make for a better jump-off point as the first Persona game you'll play, and that's because of how a lot of things and mechanics are a little bit outdated. A little bit of a background, Persona 4 Golden was a re-release in the same manner as Persona 5 Royal, in which Persona 4 Golden gets new stories, new characters, new social links, while overhauling the gameplay with a lot of polish, quality of life, and some graphical overhaul. But the game is still lifted from the original Persona 4 on the PS2, originally re-released for the PS Vita. So stuffs like the character models, the dungeon crawling gameplay, while serviceable at the current state, they look kinda ugly at this point. There are little to no facial expressions, so you have to heavily rely on the portraits of the characters that show up from time to time. The dungeon crawling gameplay is not as good as well. You can't sprint while dungeon crawling. The fact that you have to physically stop moving for an attack, and the AI of the enemies can sometimes be broken, or that they can quickly ambush you with their turning maneuver. There can be a lot of frustrations in the game, and a lot of it is because it is such an old game. However, to be positive for a second, Persona 4 Golden is strangely not a challenging game at all. But this is mostly because of how easy it is to cheese the enemy. Persona 4 is the birth of Yoshitsune, the persona that can do one move and deletes every enemy in the battle. Heck, it even works against bosses. This is also the game that introduces custom difficulty that allows you to configure the amount of money, experience, and damage taken or dealt in battle, which means that you can tailor the difficulty of the game to your liking, so it will subconsciously make the game easier. So in a nutshell, the barrier of entry for Persona 4 Golden is practically that the game looks uglier in comparison to the other newer Persona games. Some frustrations about the game also occur on top of that ugliness, and you might think that it isn't really a problem, but I can tell that the newer, younger player base won't stand for a game that has models imported straight from the PS2 era. Furthermore, if we're also talking about the opening of a game being a great decider on if players may stick or quit the game, Persona 4's story is a lot slower in comparison to Persona 3 and Persona 5. I guess slow isn't the best description of it. It's more like because Persona 4 focuses a lot on the peaceful and quote-unquote a place with nothing to do side of Inaba, not much really happened in the in-between story. The best thing that's happening is probably a section of the story where you get some sort of a lead in a mystery story where you try to uncover things with the available clues, that and sprinkled with a lot of the team's high school friend group moments, which I really liked. I guess what I meant to say is that Persona 4 feels a lot different than Persona 3 and Persona 5. It is dependent on the player's attention span and patience to make the game click. It is kind of a bummer that the negatives can outweigh the positives in some regards, because as I've said before, I think this is the best Persona out of all the Persona games, at least in terms of the story and characters. But hey, because this looks like the most outdated game out of the bunch, this is the cheapest game as well, so there's a merit to it if you consider budget to be a huge factor of your choice. So, in summary, Persona 4 Golden is not a good starting point for a Persona game in comparison to Persona 5 Royal and Persona 3 Reload due to it being slightly outdated. But if you can't get over the flaws, this is an amazing game to play either the first time or the third time going into the Persona series. Persona 4 Golden is my first recommendation after you played Persona 5 Royal and Persona 3 Reload. However, as I've said before, Persona 4 Golden sits in the easy category in terms of difficulty. You might think by now, is there any game that offers a Persona-like experience but has challenging difficulty? If you like the Persona building gameplay of Persona and want some more challenge, we also have a game for you. Shin Megami Tensei is the sister series of Persona. I was about to say it is kind of a spin-off of Persona, but I know some of you might say that technically Persona is the spin-off of Shin Megami Tensei. And yeah, I guess you're right. Anyway, after your venture to the Persona series, there is a small chance that you'll think that you enjoy playing around with collecting personas, customizing your personas, and utilizing those personas to win your battles. You might eventually say that Persona feels like a Pokemon game, and you might wish that Persona leans a lot more to the Persona-centric gameplay. Well, Shin Megami Tensei is the series for that. Shin Megami Tensei is the premier Persona collecting game and make those personas fight for you, as they essentially are your party. However, we refer to personas as demons here, just to be clear, because they don't function as your main character's persona, but instead they are their own party members. While the game will sometimes allow you to recruit non-demon party members, but the main point of the game is the relationship between you and the demons, whether you recruit demons by talking to them, negotiating with them, or by fusing them into a stronger demon, similar to how Persona did it. Let's get to the nitty-gritty of Shin Megami Tensei. Shin Megami Tensei had a different combat system than Persona. Persona approaches their turn-based combat in a more classic turn-based JRPG style, with every character in combat having their own turn, and the order is scaled on which character had the most agility stat. Plus, that one more system with the weakness exploit system, where characters can exploit an enemy's weakness through specific elements. Shin Megami Tensei didn't use that turn-based combat system, but instead, they used their own combat system called the press turn system. The press turn system divides turns into your team's turn and the enemy's turn. On each turn, each team is given turn icons according to the amount of members that are on their team. These turn icons will act as how much that team can do actions in a single turn. For example, your team has 4 members, so you are given 4 turn icons at the start of your turn. And with those 4 turn icons, you can do 4 actions from members in a specific sequence. Member 1 does an action. The turn shifts to member 2. Member 2 does an action. The turn shifts to member 3. And so on until the turn icons deplete, and that's the other team's turn. A weakness exploit mechanic is present in Shin Megami Tensei as well. However, the way they implement it into the press turn combat system is that one turn icon, if used for an attack that hits a weakness, it uses half of it instead, and that half turn icon can be used for another action, essentially doubling the action for that turn icon. As a result, one turn may result in this. With 4 turn icons, you can do up to 8 attacks as long as 4 of those hit a weakness, making one turn kill playstyle very possible and even encouraged. However, this does come with some drawbacks. For example, this press turn system will naturally affect your enemies as well, making your enemies even more brutal than what Persona could have been. Enemies may one turn kill you instead with the technique that I mentioned before. This is where the community conceptualized the SMT meme. The fact that enemies can and will instantly kill you on their first turn is brutal. Not only that, but the press turn system also has more mechanics regarding defensiveness. To prevent the one turn kill to happen too much, defensive occurrences like evading, blocking, reflecting, and absorbing attacks have additional effects on the turn icons. Evading or blocking will deplete double the turn icons that were used for that attack, and reflecting or absorbing will deplete all remaining turn icons. So there are some strategies that can be used to maximize the gameplay of Shin Megami Tensei. Personally speaking, I highly prefer the press turn combat system because of its high risk, high reward nature, and the numerous strategies that can be pulled to turn the tides of battle is a lot more than what Persona's one more system can achieve. That being said though, as I've said before, this makes the press turn combat a lot harder than Persona's one more system. The press turn system rewards a good strategy play, but punishes even a single blunder. Either you die in a single turn, or that you didn't die, but you have to spend resources and consumables, making the next battles harder and harder. It is not a very beginner-friendly combat system because of that. Naturally, new players that are getting used to the combat will in one way or another do some misplays, or not play optimally in general. It is a huge learning curve, but to me, once you get it, it's the most fun I've had on a turn-based system. Oh, and one more thing that is noticeable in the Shin Megami Tensei series that newer players won't get into instantly, the story is not that great. It's not bad per se, but it's not as highly regarded as Persona in their overall theming. Shin Megami Tensei's story usually follows the end-of-the-world narrative, with variations of characters and approaches with each game. This applies to Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne, Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance, and to a certain extent, Shin Megami Tensei 4 and Apocalypse as well. I don't know of other games in the series, but with 3 games having pretty much the same setup, I think it's okay to say that this series is about the end-of-the-world narrative. It will also branch to an alignment system where you essentially pick which faction you would support throughout the game. In this series, it's usually an alignment between order versus chaos. It dictates what world you would want to support the creation of after the end of the world. So yeah, it can be a little bit front-loaded in the story side and a bit convoluted, but that's the general thing about Shin Megami Tensei. A game that focuses on demon collection, building, and brutal turn-based combat, while in the end of the world setting where factions fight for the creation of a new world. Now, I'm gonna tell you the info that I should have mentioned earlier. Which Shin Megami Tensei should you play? You know, funnily enough, the order that I would recommend is exactly the same as Persona. However, the difference being that playing one game is probably enough. I would suggest to just play Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance. Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance has 4 routes, with each route being like 60 to 70 hours, I think. It is a very large game, the most modern out of all the Shin Megami Tensei series, and personally, the most fun I've had on a Shin Megami Tensei game. Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne is also highly regarded as one of the best, and yeah, I think that holds some ground, but its archaic dungeon crawling experience really bogs it down for me. That is because of how they handle encounters and ambushes. Similar to what you can do in Persona or SMT5, you can ambush enemies for a turn advantage, and you can get ambushed for their turn advantage. In Persona and SMT5, enemies have models in the world, so you can level the playing ground by sneaking to their backs to ambush them. That is unfortunately not the case for Nocturne, as there are no enemy models in the world. How it works is that you run through an empty dungeon and then randomly encounter enemies and instantly get into the turn-based battle. There is no indication on when it is a normal or an ambush encounter. It is basically random. So you can just leisurely walk down a path and then suddenly a group of enemies ambush you and then you die, prompting you to go back to the last save point. That is simply infuriating, as there is no counterplay against that as well. The game just decides that you shouldn't play. This is why I don't want to suggest SMT3 Nocturne for your first SMT game, let alone your first Persona/Atlus game, because this may break your opinion for these games. So yeah, if you really want some more challenge in the franchise, definitely get a chance to get Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance first. And if that's not enough for you, then Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne will be the next one on the list. Alright, that's a really long journey we've had. So far, it's pretty much set in stone, with the order of Persona 5 to Persona 3 and then to Persona 4, with an alternative of SMT5 Vengeance for a more challenging game. It's not easy for a game studio to release 4 80 hours-ish bangers. I'm sure there are no more games that they've released that go up to these standards, right? Metaphor ReFantazio, the subject of a lot of my videos recently, and the current hot Atlus JRPG. Metaphor ReFantazio is simply amazing to me. It essentially mixes the storytelling bits of Persona, creating a twist with the overall theming and message of the story, and put it into a fantasy world. On top of that, it also takes the press-turn combat system that SMT had, rebalances it with some new systems, and mixes them all up into one game. That might seem like a Frankenstein of a game, but with deliberate care by the dev team that made the Persona games, Metaphor ReFantazio came out to be one of the best JRPGs that I have ever played in my life. So, what is Metaphor ReFantazio? As I've said before, it is a story set in a fictional fantasy story, where kings are still in the highest status, with one overpowering belief of the Catholic Church. It is a fresh new story and setting that at the same time is a pretty familiar story beats with Persona by itself. Some parallels can be made between these two, like the overall action of uncovering the mystery of a power system, or to some extent, the constant overthrowing the mighty higher-ups narrative. I know I'm not really selling it with this description. However, the fresh paint of the setting and the higher stakes of the character not being in a modern and school setting, but instead in a wild and dangerous medieval fantasy setting makes Metaphor ReFantazio to be one of the strongest narrative in any Atlus games. The gameplay of Metaphor ReFantazio don't hold back as well. Metaphor employs the same turn-based combat as SMT, being the press turn combat system. Metaphor also extends the combat to two parts, the press turn combat system and an overworld system, where before you engage in the press turn combat system, you can attack freely as if it's an action game in the overworld. The advantage here is to chip down the enemy's HP first to directly help the press turn combat system, or on a successful beatdown, it stuns the enemy for one turn, so that it helps you clear out the enemy unscathed, helping the economy of resources for the next fights. Or, better yet, the action combat can instantly clear out the enemy if you are way higher level than they are. While the overworld action combat can be clunky at some point in time, it helps quite a lot in making the press turn system fresh and exciting to engage in, as there are more ways to engage combat than one. However, that's arguably one of the least impactful changes to the gameplay system that changes how you approach the game. You see, there is no persona or demons in this world, but instead, our characters fight with what's called archetypes. Archetypes, to put in simply, is a combination of the classic RPG job system and persona. Archetypes come in multiple forms as the description of jobs. There are classic RPG jobs like a warrior, a mage, a healer, a thief, or a knight, and even to some special jobs like seeker or mass dancer. As per their description, your characters can channel one of these archetypes, essentially being that job to fight. One day, you want to be a warrior, the next day, you want to be a thief. Every archetype can be channeled into every playable character. This leads to Metaphor's party building gameplay to be way deeper than Persona ever could have been, where in Persona, other playable characters can only employ skills within their restricted pool of learnable skills, making them only be a certain playstyle or two. Metaphor's party member building gets deep because any character can be any playstyle. Of course, there are definitely some restrictions into which are better at what playstyle, but the fact that you have that freedom of your builds is what makes building in this game more exciting than Persona. The potential is way higher. Take for example, Heisme, who awakens the thief archetype at first, boasting a high agility stat to effectively dodge a lot of attacks. While you can make him to be a normal, speedy damage dealer type of character, alternatively, you can make him a dodge tank. Using a skill from the knight archetype, he can direct a lot of enemies' attacks, and since he has naturally high agility, more chances than another, he will dodge some of the attacks that are coming to him, which in the press turn system, it depletes double the turn icon, which shortens the amount of actions the enemy gets. There are a lot more examples to this, like a healer being a super offensive spellcaster, or using merchant to deal lots of critical hits. The possibility is endless, and this is mostly why Metaphor ReFantazio is highly regarded as the new hot Atlus JRPG. Honestly, to me, Metaphor ReFantazio can also be the first ever game you play out of all the games that I've listed today, even above Persona 5 Royal. It is still a debatable topic, but I can safely say that due to the amount of enjoyment I get from playing this game 3 times already. However, because the topic of today is which Persona game you should play first, it is unfortunately shunned to be Persona's sister series as of now, and is a worthy candidate to play if you want a change of pace from the modern Japanese setting of Persona. Metaphor ReFantazio sits in a spot beside Persona 4 Golden and Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance, a game where you play around after you play Persona 3 Reload. Alright, that's about it with my recommendations of which Persona game you should play first. Here is a recap of my rankings. Play Persona 5 Royal first, then Persona 3 Reload. After Persona 3 Reload, you have a choice of branching to other games or stay within the Persona series. If you still want Persona, play Persona 4 Golden. If you want more challenge with the gameplay or want more of the Persona building gameplay, play Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance. If you want a little bit of a spin on the Persona story in a fantasy setting, play Metaphor ReFantazio. Or if you like Persona 3 that much, play Persona 3 Portable for the female MC route. You know, as I'm writing this video, a lot of instances I notice are that I really suck at explaining the story of a game. So if I happen to say something wrong about the story, or if I miss some point of the story, hey, I'm sorry. And please let me know. I am better at analyzing gameplay, and I need to brush up on story analysis stuffs. With all that said though, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon, I hope.